Okay, good evening. I think we can start. Welcome, all of you. Welcome to the LSE. This is a talk very graciously co-sponsored by the Department of International Development and the LSE's very exciting new Global Sustainability School. I'm Jean-Paul Faguet. I'm Professor of the Political Economy of Development in the Department of International Development. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Geoffrey West. Geoffrey is one of the most extraordinary characters I've ever met, and I've met a bunch of characters, and so this is a mouthful, but I really mean it. I had the great pleasure to get to know him at the Santa Fe Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico, this previous academic year where I visited on sabbatical for 6 glorious months. Geoffrey began his intellectual journey studying mathematics and physics at Cambridge. Then he went to Stanford in 1961. So most of you are too young, but if you could sort of imagine a young man who grew up in the UK, around London, goes to Cambridge to study, and then pitches up in California in 1961. He lived the 60s in California, the summer of love and all of that. He got his PhD in physics. He has since worked, studied, been professor, etc., at places like Cornell and Stanford. I'm just going to give you a brief. This is a tiny bit of the story. He went back to Stanford as a professor. From there, he went to the Los Alamos labs, where he founded and managed the high energy physics unit for 30 years. He then went to the Santa Fe Institute, which he also became head of for a time, but he's been a professor there for a couple of decades now. The main thing I can say to commend him to you is he has a stunning intellectual breadth of interest and of achievement. So it goes from physics, from theoretical physics and high energy physics, across geography, economics, politics, sociology, and even anthropology, where he applies his power laws to ideas of scaling from the intramolecular scale to the global scale, taking in cities, communities, firms, and everything in between. I'll stop there because he can explain what he does much better than I can. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Geoffrey West.
I think it's on. Can everybody hear me? Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for that slightly embarrassing introduction. I'm sure I'm going to disappoint. But anyway, but thank you for Jean-Paul for inviting me and to the departments for hosting this event. So here's the title, and it's a little grandiose, and I will be talking about the whole question of sustainability, but mostly it's to do with what are the constraints and what are the dynamics that have been at work globally and locally that have led us to even ask this question. And it's the question that one needs to answer, that is, how did we get here and what are those dynamics at work, in order to answer this question, which is, in a certain sense, the primary one. How do we sort of have this kind of wonderful life that some of us are privileged to participate in for the entire planet into, the distant future? Now, what was indicated by Jean-Paul is that I'm a physicist by training and profession, and I still consider myself that, even though I work in many different fields. And this talk, in fact, I decided I will shamelessly make it from a physics perspective, even though I will show no equations. I mean, it's just in terms of the conceptual framework. But having said that, I should make it clear at the beginning, with a lot of help from people outside of physics, my non-physics friends, social scientists, computer scientists, mathematicians, and so on and so forth, and economists, by the way. But I want to begin by being a little pedantic and tell you what I mean by physics, what that framework is. And I'm going to start with a quote from a man named Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize 30, 40 years ago. And he makes this statement, you can read how: our job in physics is to see things simply, to understand a great many complicated phenomena in a unified way in terms of a few simple principles. And I would extend that to say it's to search for underlying laws and principles, but leading to something that's quantitative, computable, therefore typically mathematical, but it could be just pure computation, but it has to be predictive and testable. And also, related to that, the idea of integrating things and seeing the big picture and the big principles and the connections. Now, I'm at the Santa Fe Institute, and the Santa Fe Institute, one of its claims, I guess, is that, it used to be that economists and physicists, even though many economists had a physics training, never talked to one another, and they were considered quite distant fields. That's changed to some extent, and you can see the great change. This is from the distinguished journal Science in 1989, and it even says, it's totally bizarre, it is hard to think of a more unlikely collaboration, the one between physicists and economists. But that one had taken place at the Santa Fe Institute, and it started this whole interaction between physicists and economists. And it had great provenance, because on the left is Phil Anderson, who got the Nobel Prize for superconductivity. And on the right is Ken Arrow. I consider the greatest economist of the last 20th century anyway. He also, of course, got the Nobel Prize, as did 4 students of his. And so there is this history, and I think there's lots more to be said and lots more dialogue to take place. So I want to go back to physics, what physics is. And I'm going to give you a quote here from Max Planck, the man that gave us the concept of the quantum, before quantum mechanics. The chief law of physics, the pinnacle of the whole system, is, in my opinion, the principle of least action, which, put in simple terms, I'm not going to discuss what least action really means, other than the implication that something is being optimized, that in fact all of the laws of physics come from something being optimized. Now, that's not generally appreciated. That is quantum mechanics, electricity and magnetism, relativity, you name it, all come from an optimization principle. And that is going to be a theme that will run through this talk, being applied to socio-economic systems, in particular to things like cities, but also biological systems. So that kind of thinking has led, of course, to some very profound consequences or understanding. We understand pretty well the universe from the Big Bang onwards, the formation of galaxies and the formation of planets and the structure of the Earth and so forth. And all that's been marvelous, and physics has been, of course, an extraordinarily successful science and has led to much of the stuff that we use technologically today. But so having given great praise and tried to explain that physics is a powerful way of thinking, and I'm going to apply it to some of the big questions about the future of the planet, I want to raise a cautionary note by giving you this quote from the richest man in the world. I tend to approach things from a framework, and physics teaches you to reason first principles rather than by analogy. And this is a quote from the richest man in the world and one of the most evil men in the world, and that's a purely editorial comment. So, with that background, here's the object of interest, us, the Earth, the planet, and I want to distinguish between what I would call the biosphere, which is, roughly speaking, everything that is not the built environment, and the built environment, often called, because that's really what the planet looks like, the anthroposphere, which I'd like to refer to as the urbanosphere, because it's dominated by cities, and in fact, the planet is dominated, of course, by all this kind of stuff. It's the only place in the universe where anything like this takes place. All of this from the microscopic to the macroscopic. And all of these have something in common. First of all, they're all complex systems. They have huge numbers of components. They're continually evolving, and they're continually adapting. And they're all interrelated to one another. Down up in the left-hand corner is a cartoon of something called the respiratory complex, which is how you get all your energy. And there's about 500 to 1,000 of those inside a mitochondrion. And there's about 500 to 1,000 mitochondria inside a cell. And you have 100 trillion cells in your body. And all of that has to happen in an extraordinarily coherent fashion so that you can all sit here listening to me and I can do all this and I can go on doing it for close to 100 years. And that's extraordinary. How in the hell can that be? It can only be if there are certain laws have evolved, have emerged from whatever the processes of evolution have been. And those are what I'm going to try to be talking about. So the first important thing, all of these are interrelated and that laws evolve from them. And I have one last quote from a physicist, from Stephen Hawking. He was asked at the turn of the millennium, some say that while the 20th century was the century of physics, we are now entering the century of biology. What do you think? And Stephen responded, I think it's the century of complexity. And indeed, I believe that. So let's begin this journey. Here's a picture taken by a NASA satellite in 1820 of the planet at night. Can't see a bloody thing, of course. Pitch black, nothing, couldn't see it. Here it is, possibly 20 years later. You might, if we had the lights off, you might see something. We've had the Industrial Revolution. Things start to happen. Here's 100 years later, 1940, when you can see. I chose 1940 because the year I was born. So this is my estimate. I did some little calculation. This is my estimate. And here it is 80 years later. And you all know what that is. Of course, what you're seeing here is the night lights of the cities. And you're seeing the urbanization, the growth of urbanization across the planet. But you also see, obviously, that it's just, you know, if you're on the outside, you didn't know what this were. You just see this planet burning more and more. And you know all this, that this is just the burning of fossil fuels. That's what's going on there. And it happens to be because all of this electricity that you see here is fueled by fossil fuels. And this is actually what the Earth really looks like. And one of the tragedies that's happening as we speak, and you will have to face when you're my age, is we're fiddling while the Earth burns. And we need to do something about it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So just to give some numbers to this, if you average now to mid-century, we're urbanizing probably well over 1 million people every week, which means you're adding the entire London metropolitan area every couple of months. So maybe by Christmas, there's the equivalent to 5 or 6 new London metropolitan areas on this planet. Or a Manchester every couple of weeks, or an Oxford every 16 hours. So when you wake up tomorrow morning and go to work, there's another equivalent of Oxford on the planet. And just to give some more numbers to it, that line across the top there is the biomass in certain units, trillions. From 1900 to 2020, it's remained much the same. These lines are that we produce, including this building, from 1900 onwards. And recently, that has now exceeded the total biomass on the planet. We're now bigger than the planet. Just all this stuff, all of this. Well, of course, you know what this is. This is all reflective of this, of the growth in the population. We started out 12,000 years ago, roughly. We discovered language. We then discovered agriculture, and the two together led to sedentary behavior, communities, and we started to build collectives. That led to cities, and we've had this gradual rise. And you notice, so to speak, the appropriate number of people on the planet when we were in harmony with nature was only about 5 to 10 million. And then, of course, we hit the Industrial Revolution, the exploitation of fossil fuels, the discovery, so to speak, of capitalism, entrepreneurship, and so forth. And those two together have let it go straight up. And of course, if you look at any metric that's global, on the left are socio-economic metrics, everything from what I've already said, the population, the GDP, paper production, tourism. They all have this hockey stick way going straight up, and anything that's called Earth system, that's material kinds of things, nitrogen production, methane, and so on. All of these go straight up. You can't see them in detail. But the point about all this is that it's not just exponential growth, it's of course faster than exponential. We've been expanding faster than exponential. And so most people, it's kind of ironic that most people are sort of vaguely familiar, at least, that we live in an exponentially expanding universe, but somehow the fact that we're actually living day to day in a faster than exponential socio-economic universe, it's kind of scary. Okay, so if you're a physicist and you look at that, you're immediately reminded of, whoops, this. What is this? This is the specific heat or heat capacity of propane, it happens to be. What is that, for those that don't know? That's the amount of heat needed to raise a kilogram of propane liquid by 1 degree. And you plot it, and it gradually rises, and then it goes bonkers, way up. And if you keep increasing the temperature, well, you sort of know what happens. Oh, by the way, I should have said, yes, thank you, I'm reminding myself there. This is also super exponential. In fact, mathematically, this is identical to that population growth curve of the planet. Now, if you keep going, what happens is it collapses. And you know what happens. Why? Because it's changed from a liquid to a gas. There's been this phase transition. We call it a phase transition in physics. It's a tipping point. And this going up essentially to infinity is called a singularity. Okay? So the question begs itself, is this, since this and this are identical, mathematically, that's what's going to happen to us soon? And if it is, how soon? And what's going to happen when you're on the other side? So that's what this talk is going to eventually confront. So I take the view that the future of our planet is intimately related to the future of our cities. And that's why I got interested in trying to understand cities from this perspective. So here's a city. And I found this unusually beautiful picture of London. London usually looks crappy, but here it looks beautiful. And here is really what a city is. That's what you think of as a city, but a city is really this. Of course, just a platform, a stage, a theater for doing what we're doing here, to bring people together, to interact. And here's a picture of New York from 120 years ago. And here's a picture from not so far from here, where I have to say, this is, I think, Brick Lane, where 70 years ago, I worked as a laborer as a boy, down there at Truman's Brewery for many years. And of course, this is what a city is for, bringing people together, interact, social networks, information exchange, create things. And of course, what's going on is A is talking to B, B is talking to C talks back to A, and we build on each other. We're continually building on each other. We're continually creating ideas, almost all of which are not interesting to other people. They don't go anywhere. They may be about your mortgage. They may be about how do you get home. They may be about the fact that Tottenham may be relegated. I don't know, whatever. They're all ideas in some sense, but they're useless. But what is extraordinary is that this phenomenon of bringing people together to interact leads to quantum mechanics, the discovery of quantum mechanics, the discovery of theory of relativity, the Amazon, to Google, to Toyota. It's this dynamic, and that's what a city does. So the city is this extraordinary machine, maybe the most marvelous machine we've invented, in order to facilitate social interaction, to create wealth, knowledge, innovation, ideas, in order to increase standards and quality of life. However, the most fundamental law of the universe is called the second law of thermodynamics, which, loosely speaking, says if you do all these wonderful things, inevitably some bad things will happen, whether you like it or not. and that's called entropy. So, whether you like it or not, you're going to create social and physical entropy. So inevitably, it may not be exactly this, but you're always going to create things like this, and so on, and you're all familiar with them. This is life, and inevitable. And the idea is you can't get rid of them, or you can get rid of some of them, but you're going to be left with something like this, and the idea is to minimize them. So things like disease and pandemic, social unrest, war. A war is now an urban problem, of course. It used to be called a battlefield, but it's no longer a battlefield. It's I know, battle city. I don't know. Anyway, this has extraordinary consequences that you're familiar with, and one of the things we don't want is cities and our life to look like this, or London to look like this. Okay, so the point is, again, just to repeat, just as I said earlier, all these things are interdependent and interrelated, and that's the whole idea of complexity and complex adaptive systems. They're all interrelated, and if you ignore that interdependence, which we normally do, because that's you have your department, then there's another department, there's departments all over this institution, and that's worked extraordinarily well, been extraordinarily successful, but some of the big problems get lost because some of them, and the biggest one, sustainability, requires everything. If you don't do that, then you have, this is a silly cartoon, but you have this problem. I don't need to explain it. You're all familiar with that phenomenon. So cities are this quintessential complex adaptive system, and just in the biggest picture, they're this integration and tension between, on the one hand, their physicality, so that's energy, resources, their thermodynamics, so to speak, and information exchange. And all of that happens through networks. So we're very familiar with these kinds of networks. The city is a network system, and I will elaborate on that shortly. But they're networks, and these networks have much in common with networks in the biosphere, in the biological world, in life. You're familiar with them. These are a bunch of networks at multiple scales. And what is interesting about it is that once you think about networks, that allows physics to start to play a role, because you can then enunciate some generic properties of these networks. And I'm not going to go through it. These are some of the generic properties of networks, of biological networks, satisfying certain mathematical and physics principles. And the only thing I want to emphasize is that these principles transcend design. That is, the idea that independent of the historical contingency and historical dependence that is inherent in natural selection, evolution by natural selection, the structure, the conceptual structure of the networks that distribute energy, resources, and information throughout organisms and throughout ecosystems, all those principles transcend the design, and they all follow from natural selection. And now going to what I said earlier about the fundamental concept of optimization in physics, they optimize. They work as they optimize. So that, for example, of the circulatory system that we all share, and by we, I don't mean everybody in this room, I mean every human being that's ever existed, every mammal that has ever existed, we all share the same circulatory system. The one that has evolved by the continuous process of natural selection, the continuous feedback that's implicit in natural selection, the one that has evolved has minimized the amount of energy your heart has to do to pump blood through your circulatory system to supply oxygen and resources to your cells to keep you alive and sustain you. It's minimized it so that you can optimize the amount of energy you devote to sex, reproduction, and the rearing of your offspring, to maximize what's called Darwinian fitness. If you do that, and you then put all of that into mathematics, which I'm not going to do here, you have to believe me, you can derive something quite extraordinary, and that's this. Namely, that the amount of energy you need to stay alive per day, metabolic rate, how much food you need to eat a day, which is the most fundamental quantity of any system, as a function of its size, the body mass, what you can derive is that straight line on a logarithmic plot, going up by factors of 10. It's a very simple law that comes from something that's quite complicated and quite complex. And then, not only that, you derive that the slope of it should be 3/4, which is what is seen there. It's called Kleiber's law. It's been known for a very long time, almost 100 years now. I will call it sublinear because the slope of it is less than 1. The most naive idea would be if you double the size of something, double the size of an organism, you have twice as many cells, you would think you would need twice as much energy, twice as much food to supply twice as many cells. No, you only require 75% more. So there's this extraordinary economy of scale that comes from as you scale up, and you can derive all this. And what is even more powerful is that you can derive similar scaling laws for essentially any physiological or life history variable of an organism. So here's a trivial one in a certain sense. This is heart rate versus size, and you derive that the slope of that should be -1/4, minus it's going down. You see it's pretty good. But actually, you can do it for, I don't know, 25 to 50 of these, and I'm not going to tell you even what they are. This is all kinds of things, like the amount of RNA in a cell, the length of your aorta, the height of trees, and so on and so forth. You can derive all these, and all of them have slopes that are multiples of 1/4. That's what you derive, and there's the data. And so underlying the extraordinary complexity and historical contingency and messiness that appears in the biosphere, there's this extraordinary regularity that is being manifested and is a constraint on natural selection. So here's those slopes, 1/4. So there it is. I've said it there. This diversity and complexity is constrained by this 1/4. Now, this has all kinds of amazing implications, and I'm just going to do a couple. And what I'm going to do, having dealt with the biosphere, I will turn to the anthroposphere to take the same idea. So the first thing I've already just said, the bigger the organism, the less energy is needed per cell or per gram of tissue, because it's governed by this 3/4 power law, this 3/4 scaling law. So there's this systematic economy of scale. But if you're using less energy per cell, that means you're doing less damage as you metabolize. Therefore, you're going to live longer. So big things are going to live systematically, because they're following these quarters, is going to live systematically longer. And here's the data. I'm afraid there's lots of variance here, and I don't want to go into all that. But just to show you, that's us. That's mammals. There they are. And you can see the slope is predicted to be 1/4, and it's very close. But here it has some very interesting consequences. So that's what I just showed you. But I showed you earlier that heart rates decrease to the 1/4. So if you multiply the two together, the increase of one is exactly compensated by the decrease of the other. Therefore, if I multiply heart rate times lifespan, I will get a constant. It doesn't change from a mouse to an elephant or from a shrew to a whale. What is heart rate times lifespan? It's the number of heartbeats in a lifetime, and that's what that is. There, and there it is. Just to bring it up, that's the number of beats in a lifetime. So it's about 1.5 billion. So even though a shrew is this size, lives for about a year and a half, 2 years maybe, and a whale is bigger than this bloody building and lives for 125 years, they have the same number of heartbeats, boom, 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 as you do when you were hunter-gatherers. Okay. So that brings up all kinds of other interesting questions about, you know, does the shrew experience life the same way that a whale does, even though a whale lives 100 times longer? Okay, won't go into that. But it also has interesting consequences for growth. So you've all grown and you've all scaled. And how does that work in this picture? It works like this. You eat, you metabolize, you send metabolic energy through these networks at the cellular level. Some of that energy goes to maintain the cell. It repairs damage that's done. It replaces ones that have died with new ones. And then it adds biomass. And you have to put that into an equation. And that arrow there is actually the network. I mean, it's being controlled by the network. Anyway, you have to put this into the mathematics using that network idea and that network mathematics and constraints. And then you derive this growth curve for us as a mouse. And you can see that the solid line is the prediction and the dots are the data. But the important point I want to emphasize is that it is the sublinear scaling, the fact that the scaling is less than linear, that is giving rise to the fact that this stops growing, because if you go back to this picture, the input, and I'll come back to this later, the incoming metabolic energy is growing slower than the demand for new growth. The new growth is sort of basically linear, but you're supplying it with something that's sublinear, so eventually you can't keep up, and you stop, and that's why you stop growing. So you can do this for any organism, and I just show you some more data, and you can rescale it, and you can do something that's quite pretty. You can rescale it so that if you look with the right lens, this is just some small sampling, everybody grows in the same way, and the theory predicts the mathematical form of that curve, and you see it's pretty good. The last thing I want to do in biology, because it's important in terms of what we're dealing with now, is temperature dependence of these phenomena. And the thing that most people are not familiar with is that chemical reaction rates are exponentially dependent upon temperature, meaning that a small change in temperature has an enormous effect. That's why, I hope I'm not being, again, pedantic. You know, my old mum, if I told her that we were worried about 1 to 2 degrees change in the temperature, would laugh. Even though, and she'd say, I'm obviously idiotic. She left school at 13, but she had the sense to realize there's something bizarre about that, because she would also say to me, where I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, it changes by 30 degrees every bloody day, in the summer anyway. So how come 1 to 2 degrees matters? Well, it matters because it's exponentially dependent. So all these things of life, if you do the calculation, 2 degrees leads to 15 to 20% increase in rates and 15 to 20% decrease in times, which wreaks havoc with everything. That's what's going on. Okay, enough. So here's the summary. We have these scaling laws dominated by this 1/4. There's economies of scale. The bigger you are, the less you need per capita, per cell. The pace of life, I didn't emphasize this, the pace of life systematically slows. Heart rates are much slower, systematically. Growth is sigmoidal, meaning you start fast, and then you stop, and then you die. And all of this can be explained by the networks. So that's it. So can we take this over to the Anthropocene? So the first question is, are cities, and I put companies here, because we also worked with companies, I'm not going to talk about those, are they scale versions of one another? I'll have to do it, even though I have to use American examples, I'm afraid. Is New York a scaled up Los Angeles, which is a scaled up Chicago, even though they look quite different? And is there any kind of universality the way we saw that quarter power? Well, cities are, of course, network structures. They're physical aspects. They have, roads and railways and electrical lines and all the rest of it. Very similar to biology. They're quite biological in their physicality. And so you wouldn't be surprised that there might be similar kind of laws for cities. But cities have something extra, which doesn't exist in biology, or at least exists in a completely different scale. And that is, we have what I already mentioned earlier. We have social networks. We interact, we create ideas. We're evolving at an extraordinarily fast rate in a kind of social manner. So much so that, I have this iPhone, which is already out of date. It's kind of ludicrous. And those networks have some very important properties. They're modular. We have families and groups and divisions and so on, and they have this kind of regular behavior. But also, more importantly, to some degree, the social networks are intertwined and interrelated with the physical networks. Because even though you have a picture like this of social networks, which is sort of a virtual picture, every one of those nodes, or maybe I should have said, each one of these nodes is a person, and all those links, of course, are to their friends. The nodes, each one of those people has to be someplace. You have to be on the ground. You have to be, in your kitchen, in your office. Not only that, you have to be moving on the ground because you have to take the kids to school. You have to go to the store, you have to go to the theater, and so on. So there's that interface. And so this is really what's going on. You have these two kinds of networks, and what you see in the middle is an example of that, those two things coming together. So so how do you address those? Well, you can also make sort of generic principles, and then you have to ask yourself, I'm not going to go into these in any detail, I just want to focus on this, because this is to do with the optimization, and the question is, I said physics runs by optimization, and in physics we know what's being optimized, and the big question here is, what, if anything, is being optimized in a city? What does a city try to optimize? So here's just some suggestion that one of the ways cities have evolved is to minimize travel time between places. People want to get to A to B. If you want to go to South Kensington, you don't first of all go to Enfield and go around the, whatever it's called, that silly road. What's it called? I forget. But you go as directly as you can, given the obvious obstacles in the way. So you try to minimize travel time and distance on the one hand, but also on the social interaction, you want to maximize your social gain. That's just a speculation. There's a certain form of greed. We'll want more of something. And if we don't want more of something, as far as I can tell, the economic system would collapse. So we want more. You don't need to have an iPhone every year. You don't need an iPhone 16, but they sell like hotcakes and so on. People do. So you put that in. I'm not going to go again with the mathematics. And you can derive similar scaling laws. They're a little different. But the infrastructure, not surprisingly, is biological in the sense that, and this is some mundane example of petrol stations versus population size plotted logarithmically. And you can see across 4 European countries, they're all roughly the same. They're all sublinear. There's an economy of scale. You need less gas stations per capita, the bigger the city. But you do it in a systematic way. And the only difference with biology for infrastructure is that the slope of this is 0.85, not 0.75. And I'm not going to actually go into that here. But what is interesting is that this is true for petrol stations in urban systems across the globe. You could do it in South America, Japan, Australia, and so on. Not only that, it's true for all infrastructure. It's not just petrol stations, it's the length of the roads, the length of the gas lines, the buildings, and so on. All the infrastructure has roughly this behavior with this kind of slope. I'm only showing this one example because the most important part is not all that stuff. The most important part is interaction, social interaction. And social interaction is this positive feedback that I talked about, and you would not be surprised, if you thought about it for a moment or two, that instead of leading to the sublinear, meaning the bigger you are, the less per capita, it leads to the bigger you are, the more per capita, the more we come together, the more interactions, and therefore the more ideas, and more of all the good stuff, the bad stuff, and the ugly, as I will talk about in a moment. But you get the superlinear, and instead of the decreasing pace of life, things slowing down the bigger you are, things get faster in a systematic way. That's what this network theory says. So here's data of metrics from different countries. You can see there's Sweden at the top, and there's the turnover of companies, property tax, divorce rates. Down there, patents in the USA, GDP of France. All of these have slopes that are very close to 1.15. Very different things. So I'm not going to dwell on details of that, but I'm going to put it into English, that the good and the bad and the ugly all come together in the following way, that this is a slightly funny way of saying it. On average, if you double the size of a city within an urban system, then systematically you save approximately 15% on all infrastructure, which I've already talked about, and at the same time, you increase all socioeconomic phenomena. That is, things I've written down: income, wealth, patents, therefore ideas, colleges, all the good stuff, but all the bad stuff as well: crime, AIDS, flu, disease in general. And so that's what all that data was, and we've done a lot of that work. And of course, COVID. So much better to be in a small town during COVID than in London, because you have more or less social interactions. But of course, for the rest of your life, much better to be in London if you're interested in more job opportunities, more culture, and so on and so forth. So here's something that, you know, you predict these scaling laws, and there's the data, but, and it's supposed to come from social interactions. So we teamed up with our colleagues at MIT, and we got billions and billions of cell phone data to measure social interactions between people and measured social interactions. So you have this cell phone data, and the way this worked was, if I call JP and you call me back within 6 months, we say we have a relationship. So you can make it 6 months, 3 months, a year, it doesn't matter. But so we did that, and here was the data, and you can see it's the same. That's the number of social interactions versus city size, and the two colors represent, one, the United Kingdom, which I think is the blue, no, is the green, I forget actually which is which, and the other is Portugal. So it's the same in both, and so forth. And I won't dwell on that, but one of the issues it does bring up is, as we move further into the 21st century, this problem that we're moving into this two-dimensional kind of soulless way of interacting, and will that change things? I don't know the answer to that, but it's an interesting question. The other thing is that, as I said, the pace of life, instead of decreasing, increases. This is walking speed, and so on. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm running behind time. And the last part, which is what all of this is by way of introduction, is, can we extend this to the entire planet and think about the planet as a whole? So here's the thing. If I were giving this lecture 50 years ago, this would be ludicrous, the idea that you could treat the planet as one kind of socioeconomic entity. But now we've had, quote, globalization, and now especially with the internet and so on, social media, you know, we're becoming, whether we like it or not, globalized to varying degrees. both socially and economically. And that is the anthroposphere. But if that is true, that you can treat the planet socioeconomically as one entity, then, of course, it's like some great big city in a certain sense. So it's a big leap to then say, well, if that's true, then if we look at socioeconomic metrics globally, they should scale. And if they, you know, if there isn't this entity, this unity, then, you know, you won't see any simplistic scaling. It'll be all over the map. That's what that says. So we took the data. So there wasn't much data for a long time. And then a few years ago, that data that I showed early on started to appear. It was made by a man named Will Steffen, who was an American who became an Australian. And he heroically put together an enormous databases of global entities, global metrics. And we took those, and here's what we found. Pretty good. It's very crude, the data, by the way, and it was pretty good. I mean, it's not great. It's binned, by the way, for those familiar. But the important thing was there was evidence, I would say good evidence, it's got kinks in it and so on, of this scaling phenomenon. It's plotted in the same way, logarithmically. These are both log-log plots, and you can see they're fundamental quantities, energy, GDP, and water. And the important thing for this is that they not just scale, but they scale as you would have predicted, superlinearly, quite superlinearly. So now I'm going to use this to finish up. It'll take me a little while, and I'll try to be quick, to finish up with the question of what the threat of sustainability is. And I need to go back, I'm afraid, to our biological metabolic rate, and that is that this graph that I said was for something that's called basal metabolic rate, which is simply the amount of energy that's needed for you to stay alive when you're doing nothing and waiting for me to finish. That's your social metabolic rate, your basal metabolic rate. And there it is there. So what is interesting is that most people don't know, you look at that scale, it's in watts. See that, the vertical scale? That if you look where we are, we're less than 100 watts. Bloody light bulb. That's all you are. 2,000 food calories a day, light bulb, which is extraordinary. Now, you don't just sit around all day, you have to hunt and gather, you do things. That's called, when you add that in, that's called active or field metabolic rate. And across mammals, that's a factor of 2 to 3 times your basal rate. That's indicated there. And we're about, so there are people still on this planet that operate like that, hunter-gatherers in New Guinea, Papua, and so on. They operate at about 250 watts. So that's how we were 10,000, 12,000 years ago. And we were like that for a few 100,000 years beforehand. What is it now? Well, our active metabolic rate, I want to use another word that other people have used, our social metabolic rate. So that's how much energy you need to maintain yourself the way you are without being, I'll define active in a minute. Namely, to be who you are, you need this building, actually. You need the clothes. You need the road out there. You need the tube. You need airplanes. You need all that. There's no such thing as an isolated human being. It doesn't exist. Can't exist. You're part of a collective, and you're part of all that junk that comes with you. Each one of us has that, has a piece of all of that. That is your basal social metabolic rate. Is all that infrastructure that goes with you. And then you have all this activity, which is not just moving around, but it's creating and developing and building new infrastructure having babies and so on, all the rest of this stuff, and that's the active part. So here we were with our active metabolic rate 10,000 years ago. What is it now? It's up there. It's about 11,000 watts. Almost 100 times your basal rate, your basal metabolic rate. So there it is. And you can turn this around and you can ask, how big an animal is each one of you sitting in this room? Oh, by the way, this may be slight, this is for the US. It's probably not so different for the UK. So how big are you? Let's assume it's the same. You're actually equivalent to about 30,000 kilograms in terms of the energy you use. It's about 30 tons, or about a dozen elephants, each person in this room. Now, there's 8 billion of us on this planet, and if you add all those up in terms of their energy use, relative to who we were biologically for several 100,000 years, hunter-gatherers, there's actually 1 trillion of us on this planet, equivalent to 1 trillion. So, and I remind you that we should have only about 5 million in terms of biologically. That's the problem. Okay, now, how does this evolve with time? Well, we have the same kind of growth equation as we had for the way you grew. That is, you have this socio-metabolic rate, and that goes to maintaining everything that's here, maintaining this building, maintaining the tube, maintaining your clothes, maintaining everything. And then you add new stuff. You build, and so forth. So this is, of course, I've simplified things significantly, but roughly speaking, you can think of this as a supply-demand kind of thing. But I've written it as supply goes to maintaining what's there and growing. And in the biosphere, what I said earlier is the supply, which was sublinear, gets eventually outstripped by the maintenance, which is linear, so there's nothing left for growth and you stop. Okay, and that's what we saw here. And that's great, because stopping growth means that you have a sustainable situation. This plays an extraordinary role in the fact that life has been around for several billion years, so it's worked extraordinarily well. Now we go to the anthroposphere. Well, there the supply is superlinear. It's going faster than the demand, which is approximately linear. So that means you just keep growing. So that's what you have. There's a cartoon version of it. That's great. Superlinear scaling these terms. So actually, this is wonderful, because you can start out with social networks, interactions, positive feedback. That leads to more per capita as you get bigger. Therefore, you get superlinear scaling, and superlinear scaling then leads to open-ended growth, and that's what you see. And in fact, you can do that and derive this, and this, and this for cities, and so on. That's fantastic. So you could think of that as a triumph or success of the theory, but it also has a frightening consequence, because it leads to, and I've taken all this time to lead up to it, it leads to a singularity. Namely, if you keep on with this, just follow it through, it leads to this thing being open-ended growth, but what it means is that in a finite time, if you just kept going, all these socioeconomic metrics would be infinite, which is completely nuts. Can't do that. And it is exactly analogous to this. Can't keep going. And you know what happened there? It collapsed, whoops, to that. So that's the question. So you have the equations. We have the equations. I just told you, I haven't shown you them. And you can carry it through and see, does it do this? And we're really in trouble. Well, it does collapse, but it collapses in a more gentle way, fortunately, so that you can go through the singularity, but you're going to collapse unless you do something. That's the point. You have to intervene. So here's the picture as a cartoon. Here it is. You're growing. This is some socio-economic quantity, GDP, whatever, patents, I don't care. You grow, and you would hit this singularity, and you would collapse. But you realize that you've derived this within a given kind of paradigm. It may be that this was derived when we've just discovered coal, maybe that we've just invented computers, maybe that we just invented laptops, but something that sets the paradigm for that age. Could be that you just discovered bronze. This could be the Bronze Age. That's why we say the Bronze Age, obviously. That somehow constrains the parameters that determine the way in which this rises. So that gives you a hint as to how you can intervene with this. It's obvious what you have to do. You have to change the paradigm. You reinvent yourself. You make a major innovation, because then you can start over again, and off you go. And of course, you'll reach another singularity. So what do? You just innovate your way out of it, and you can keep going. Well, this has been, economists in particular have talked about that for a long time. You have these cycles of innovation and so on. And in fact, I may be speaking out of turn, I don't know. Economists have done us a very bad turn by giving us the impression we can always innovate ourselves out of these, just by continually, because we're so clever, we're continually innovation. And that indeed has been the history of what we have done. However, if you believe all the stuff I've been telling you and you follow through the mathematics, it leads to this problem. It leads to two problems, actually. That first, it leads to something that's good, that you can, in fact, it's a theorem, that if you want to have continuous open-ended growth, you have to have these paradigm shifts. But the price you pay is that the time to go from this one to this one is necessarily and systematically shorter than going from this one to this one, and so on. So it's part of the accelerating pace of life. Life speeds up, and you have to do it faster and faster in a systematic way. And here's some data. I don't know who this guy is. I just found this on the web. I've stolen it, and he'll probably sue me one day when he finds out I'm using it in talks. I tried to find out who he is. But he took it, and it looked like what I'd done, so I just copied. I figured he owes me one in a certain sense. But those numbers in parentheses are the time to reach 10 million customers. So it's kind of a proxy for this change. And if you take those numbers, by the way, it agrees ridiculously well with the prediction of this little theoretical framework. But here's another way of doing it. This was done, I forgot to put this by this guy, Ray Kurzweil, who has been obsessed with the singularity, but in a very different context. But this is his stuff, not mine. But what it is on the vertical axis is how long it took to develop cells. It took several billion years, actually, to develop. So all the way down to the internet, which took less than 10 years. And along here is how long ago it happened. So the theory predicts this, and that line is the prediction of the theory. I don't want to claim, I don't know. What you consider a singularity and a major innovation is a little bit in the eyes of the beholder. Here's another way of representing it in a linear way, where you see it's the same graph, except this is now linear, and you can see everything piles up here. And that line, a version of the line, is what is predicted by this theory. So I'm going to finish up by telling you what it predicts without giving the formula. Here's what it predicts as a test. It predicts that if you plot the logarithm of a socioeconomic metric, like the ones I said, energy, water, and so on, against the logarithm of how close you are to the singularity, it predicts for the globe, it should be a straight line. for the whole globe, something incredibly simple for the whole globe. That's what it predicts. And not only that, it predicts the slope of that straight line, and it predicts the value of when the singularity will be. So here's the data. There it is, and it's pretty good. It's a straight line. I'm sorry, something got messed up here. But what we discovered was something weird when we examined the data. There was a straight line, but it was actually two straight lines. And you ask, when did that break happen? This is just data. I mean, you didn't have to know this theory. I mean, the theory told you how to plot it. And it's true for all these metrics, and I'm just showing you water and energy, that there was something we avoided a potential singularity around the mid-70s. And you can speculate, and I'm happy to speculate, about what the hell happened, what was happening there. It's to do with globalization and so on. So, and the present data, I should point out something here, that this is the log of the time to the singularity. Calendar time is going that way, because it's the time to singularity. So it's all, unfortunately, the way you plot it, time goes backwards, that is, increasing time is that way. So, and you can predict when it's going to happen, but there's huge variance because the data is not really good, and I can discuss that a little bit in question time or whatever. But I want to finish with this, leaving it sort of hanging, and just make a couple of comments. One is that this unbounded growth, which is our great success, the extraordinary success of modern human beings on this planet, has also led to our greatest threat, namely these singularities, and they're called finite time singularities, because what it means is that something's going to happen in a finite time. It doesn't take an infinite time for these metrics to potentially go to infinity. And the way you avoid them is you make systematic innovations, and they have to be faster and faster. And that is a manifestation of the accelerating pace of life for everything. And one of the issues that brings, in addition to the threat of collapse, is the fact that you are fundamentally no different than your hunter-gatherer ancestor of 10,000 or 100,000 or 200,000 years ago. You have the same biology, basically the same brain, and yet all of us have to adapt faster and faster to these new technologies. It drives me nuts. I'm 84 years old, and I still collaborate with people your age, and we write papers, and they say, oh, we're going to do this one on Google Doc. I say, I just learned whatever it was, I don't know, something else. I'm having to learn these. I'm going nuts, frankly. And you have to do that, and it's going to get faster and faster. But you have the same brain and the same biology, and the question is, when does that reach a breaking point? When is it that we can't keep up? And I'm now going to jump into something editorial. I think we cannot keep up, and we haven't kept up, and that's why we have a Donald Trump and an Elon Musk telling us how to run things in the United States, and that we're in dire trouble. Okay, that's editorial. It's not me as a scientist. It's just me as an old-fashioned liberal socialist. So here we are. This is what we look like. We're Sisyphus rolling the stone up to the top of the hill, and it rolls down again. Then we've got to roll it back up. That's these innovations, and each of us sort of has to participate in it. But it's much worse than Sisyphus. Sisyphus had it easy because it went up and down at the same rate each time. We have to do it faster and faster each time. And the question is, any of that sustainable? Now, I'm going to finish with one last biological thing, which is a counter to all this. I think this is the plot, which is a counter. And that is the same theory that gives rise to all this also has this curious prediction that fecundity, meaning how many the reproduction rate of women, of babies, remarkably is predicted to decrease like the cubed root of the metabolic rate. That's what you predict. So that says, mathematically, for those who are familiar, that if I plotted log of fecundity, reproduction rate, versus log of metabolic rate, taking metabolic rate as socio-metabolic rate, it should decrease with a slope of 1/3. And there's the data. For the United States, at least, it's very close to 1/3. In fact, you can see actually it's decreasing a little bit faster towards the end, if you believe that data. But the point is, this is, of course, part of the saving grace, but it also brings up the problem that our socio-economic system is based on population growth. So we have this tension between we need to decrease the population. There's natural forces that are decreasing it. That's why we have to have immigrants. Every country, every developed country desperately needs immigrants because it's not reproducing, because its social metabolic rate has become so high. And so there's a bunch of interesting issues there, which we're all struggling with. So let me go back to this, the collapse. So what is that collapse means? Another way of saying it is that we're transitioning from the great acceleration to the great deceleration, which may well happen in your lifetime, amazingly. And there's kind of this crossroads we're at between going over the singularity and letting it all happen, which is what's happening now, which will inevitably lead to even more chaos and conflict and instability. Or, and this is my going back to being in California during the 60s and 70s with hair down to my waist, the opportunity of peace, stability, respect, and harmony. And I took out love because I thought that was going a bit far, but I do mean it. So what we need is a new integrated conceptual framework, which I dub the grand unified theory of sustainability. It needs to be systemic, holistic, quantitative, and all the rest of it, but it obviously will be hugely informed by big data, machine learning, and AI. And I only put one cautionary thing in. I'm a great fan of AI and big data and thing, but mindless use of it, which is pretty much what's happening, is going to could lead to many disasters. But the biggest change we need, of course, is a fundamental revolutionary change in our mindset. Now, and lastly, just to get a little credibility to my speculations about singularities and all the rest, I assume everybody knows who John von Neumann is. If not, you're better, because your life that you live has been framed by the ideas of von Neumann. This and everything associated with it, the whole architecture, is von Neumann. Game theory is von Neumann. If there had been a Nobel Prize for economics, he would have got it. The greatest mathematical physicist of the 20th century. Foundations of quantum mechanics, everything. And here's what he said in 1953. The ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race, beyond which human affairs as we know them could not continue. Curiously, for von Neumann, who mathematized everything, he actually did not mathematize this. So I take this, what I've done is just scratching the surface in a vain attempt at trying to put some flesh on this remarkable statement. Finally, I just want to show pictures of the people who did all the bloody work. So me. These are all the people involved. And the thing I'm showing is that they're across many different fields. And just to give you an example, Alex down here came out of physics and worked with me as a student. He's now a professor of psychiatry in the University of Minnesota Medical School. Here's another bunch of work with me that came out. Vicky Yang is a professor now at the Sloan School of Management at MIT, Heijin at Kellogg School, I don't know, all over. Anyway, these guys are the senior people that work with me, did nothing. Those are the guys that did all the work, all those, and so on. But they come from very different fields and so on. Oh, and lastly, these. And finally, if you're interested, I wrote a book called Scale. This is the British version of it. And it says much of what I said, actually, except for all that last part. Okay, I finished that one. I'm probably way too long, and I apologize. And,
fantastic, thank you.
Thank you.
So we have 15 minutes for questions, but then Geoffrey's kindly agreed to stay, and the department is inviting us to drinks, which will be served over there. So if you want to stay and chat with Geoffrey for a bit afterwards, I am going to have to ask, please, that the drinks not leave this room, because this is the only room in this building that is licensed for wine, for food generally. So, questions, queries, challenges? Yes, right here.
I'm wondering about the counter to the argument that reproductive rate is that reproductive rate is decreasing. Are we not kind of offsetting the reduction in reproductive rate in the global north to the global south?
Sorry, I couldn't hear because of the thing.
Are we not offsetting the reproductive rate decrease in the global north and the global south?
Ah, that's it, yes. So, like all of this work, I've done, there's some extraordinary averaging that's been done. And indeed, for a lot of this, you then have to go and deconstruct this and look at a much finer level, finer scale, and so on. And that question, after all, what surprised me, just going back to that data of the global metrics, was, there's a huge variation across the planet, of course, of socio-economic systems, infrastructure, and so on. So it's quite surprising, in a way, that it scales as well as it does. So one would have to think about the same thing, which I've not done. I just threw that in, funnily enough, at the end, the thing about reproduction. One would have to go and look, because it is, and that's why I use the word migration. It's clear that the rates in Europe, in the United States, and so on, have now gone below replacement rate, and that's what that would have predicted, actually, that it's below replacement rate. And it's only because there are vast parts of the world where the social metabolic rate hasn't risen high enough, in quotes, to go below that. So you have to do that, you'd have to look at that, you'd have to model that quite carefully to see what that dynamic does longer term as that changes. So I'm not answering your question. It's simply, but it's a very good question, an important question. If I still had students, I would give it would be a very interesting thing for someone to do a thesis on.
Yes, right here and then there. So we'll start here.
Hi, thanks. I didn't quite understand why you said that population growth looks like the heat capacity. So the heat capacity has a singularity at the critical temperature, right? Because it scales as 1/T. And then you showed all these examples from biology, which are logistic, so they taper off.
Yeah, they were quite different.
But then you said, well, but the population looks just like the heat capacity. Why isn't the population also logistic? It couples to what the previous question was, which is that if we have a decreasing birth rate, you would have a counteracting mechanism that might lead one to suggest that population is logistic, and the population is reaching a plateau, right? So it's not growing.
Sure. Well, at the moment, of course, I was just showing you the historical data and showing you what, and that's what the data is. It does look like it's identical. I could take that heat capacity and just rescale it, and it would fit perfectly on that, because it's the same mathematics, actually. what has to be folded into that are two things: how close you are to the singularity, because you saw the singularity, then it starts to stagnate. If you follow through, it stagnates, and then it decreases. And so I'm not sure what your concern is. I mean, that's what's beginning to happen now. And in fact, you could argue that the concern longer term is, that's why I put in, is that you could have, the planet could go through a decelerating rate, which is in fact given by those equations. I'm not showing you the mathematics, which are in those equations. I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood your question.
Well, I mean, if birth rates are falling, you would expect logistic growth, right?
If they were 4 years. So I'm saying that's why, you know, you have to fold that in. But the dominant thing has been the driver of social metabolic rate when it's been above replacement rate. So this is, you know, you have to take this into account now as you start to swing over. And you do see, and then it will slow down. And the question is, you know, in what way are we able to adapt to a decreasing population and the decay, the consequential decay of our cities? I mean, that's really what I'm leading up to, actually.
I think we had a question over here.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor West, for a brilliant talk. I do not want to sound like a biological determinist, but one of the things that I extract from your talk is that the entropy that we are experiencing in our cities and societies and communities is that the world is getting incredibly complex, and we are not well suited to it because we are dealing with it with brains and biological bias that have been crafted like 300,000 years before, when our societies were even pre-agrarian. Having said that, you propose like a radical revolutionary change of mindset so we could adapt to these new like realities that are getting increasingly complex. But I see a word and a media that is not only increasingly complex, but it's like going beyond biological limits, going back to the question asked to Stephen Hawking. We are getting like with AI advancement at all, with the integration of like the informatics and robotics, we will enter into a post-biological or inorganic world. So in that sense, rather than a change in our mindset, would you recommend that we as a species strive to adapt to these post-organic environments by fusioning and being probably something that we could call like post-human?
I couldn't understand. Did you
The sound is very bad. So let me try summarizing. Yeah, let me try summarizing.
See if you
so you're calling for a change of mindset.
Yeah.
But we're all equipped with Paleolithic brains, right, from 300,000 years ago. And he says that social media and the sort of media environment is progressing at a faster and faster rate. So can there be some sort of robotic, artificial, biological synthesis that then allows us?
That's what I thought you said. Good. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that's the big question. You know, I mean, there's a lot of science fiction-y kind of speculation, and some of it's more than speculation, of course, that, you know, some kind of cyborg or some kind of, you know, integration of some electronics with the human mind, that changes it. You know, that's an evolutionary step, and you know, it's not clear what the consequences of that will be. I'm very skeptical because one of the things you learn when you study complex systems is that once you start messing with one piece of it, it tends to propagate through and have deleterious effects elsewhere. I mean, so the classic example being the 2008 crisis, economic crisis, which started with something on the grand scale of things is quite trivial. You know, a small part of the mortgage industry in the United States somehow created something enormous, or even more so, the whole COVID pandemic. starting with, I mean, who would believe that a virus evolved in China would, you'd end up not being able to buy yeast in the United States, or would stop football in Spain. I mean, you don't think of those being causally connected, but in fact they are in some weird way. And so I'm somewhat skeptical that we can do it without even more deleterious consequences. I don't mean that we shouldn't investigate such things, quite the contrary. I think it's very exciting to look into those things. It's just that I think we're on dangerous ground often in these things. So I don't know, but that may be a solution. So that's why I put it very conservatively, that we need some revolutionary change. And of that, I'm quite skeptical. And I think you sort of basically indicate, maybe I put words into what I was hearing. But I'm quite skeptical of what I suggest there, just because who we are seems to now be in our social DNA. And the real problem ultimately is we have almost no time to deal with it. I mean, that's the big issue is, in fact, that it's happening so quickly.
We have a question over here.
That was a great setup. For my question is, I want to go back to what you said about, you were talking about interdependencies.
Well, which?
Interdependencies, yeah. So, and you've been talking, first of all, the collapse that you're talking about, this is the anthroposphere, and I'm wondering about the biosphere, and you've been talking about socio-economic systems, and I'm wondering about socio-ecological systems. So are those coupled in this scenario, or how do you see this working?
What was the question? What was the last part?
Oh, well, about their
say,
socio-economic systems,
yeah,
and then
I think my
socio-ecological
ears
systems. Sorry. So basically, I mean, we've already transgressed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, about to transgress ocean acidification, which is the 7th. And I'm just wondering how all of that fits in to the scenario you're presenting here.
Well, I don't know how it fits in, but it could be fit in. I mean, it requires, it's like these questions about north-south and so on. It requires, a study of its own. And I consider this, and I should have said at the beginning, and I forgot to say it, this was very much purposely a kind of view from 100,000 feet, very coarse-grained, to try to get a conceptual framework to think about many of these problems, partially motivated by the fact that almost all the problems we face, we tend to treat within a very narrow spectrum, and we think of them as independent, mostly, of all the other things that are happening. It's not always the case, but often the case. And so I wanted to try to present a more unified framework where you can see that, for example, the socioeconomic world we live in which often appears quite distinct from the biological world, actually is just a variation on the same theme, which manifests itself quite differently. But underneath it all, there's a very similar dynamic and similar kinds of constraints that are at work in the dynamic. So that's what I was trying to do, and to provide a point of departure for asking questions about specific components of it, and so forth. So therefore, for example, climate change is, which deservedly gets an enormous amount of attention, is just one manifestation, but should not be thought of just as climate change. It should be thought of as, integrated with all these other phenomena. So that's sort of the framework. I haven't answered your question either.
I think I'm going to have to draw it to a close there because it's 8:30 on the dot right now. I'm very sorry, but please do approach, get a drink, and come and continue your questions with Geoffrey one-on-one or in groups And thank you so much, Geoffrey. Thanks to all of you for coming.